Thanks very much, Ken. I guess after that you can expect a good talk. Merci. Okay, I'm just going to jump in. Okay, so my training as a historian coincides with the birth of social history across the Western world, and interviews were one of the methods promoted to retrieve the lives of ordinary people. And I've always really worried that someone might seek to interview me about my life and that my answers would disappoint them or that I would forget things they wanted to know about. Perhaps this was confirmed when on sabbatical in Australia, I ended up at a dinner next to a very hip nun whose conversational opener was to ask me to tell her the most interesting thing about me. I gulped and then replied that I was the only New Zealander who studies Quebec history. Conversation stopped. Dead. Worries confirmed. However, after Colin Coates asked me to do this lecture and made it clear that he wanted me to talk about myself, or at least that's how I heard about it, and my trajectory as a historian, I decided I rather liked the idea of reflecting on how I was drawn to the topics I studied, on the intellectual influences along the way, and how they were shaped by particular historical and historiographical moments, books, etc. So I have interpreted the task here as being to explain how I became the historian that I think I am. Framed differently, one might ask how a Kiwi girl with a BA in English and sociology became a Quebec historian, and how I came to write family histories that sought to marry quantitative and feminist analyses in order to gender particular historical moments and events, most specifically first industrialization, more recently widowhood in 19th century Montreal, and now issues of property, marriage, and inheritance in the 19th century British Empire. I entitled this talk, Twists, Turning Points, and Tall Shoulders, not so that I could speak about my adventures tandem paragliding, as the poster announcing the talk might suggest. This was a present from my daughters for my 60th birthday, but to highlight first the twists, the historical accidents in my personal life that have shaped my career to date. Second, the turning points in historical writing and broader epistemologies that have influenced me. And to highlight, thirdly, the tall shoulders upon which I stand, including how I acquired skills along the way, the social movements, branches of history, and particular scholars upon whose ideas I have built, and all those who have supported me as an academic and a person. So this will be a biography of sorts, an interweaving of individual, family, social, and academic history rather than an intellectual history. It's also a story of privilege at multiple levels. But where to begin? Such a thing. I guess I'm a product of the British colonization of the South Pacific, born in another white settler society in the British Empire, New Zealand. That shows I'm a 19th century historian. On my mother's side, my great-great-grandfather was a German Jew, sent to Manchester to learn the trade. I like to think around the time that Engels was there checking out on the conditions of the English working class. He migrated from there with two of his brothers to Australia when gold was found in Victoria, and then on to Otago, New Zealand, highly unsuitable poster for a series run by the Canadian Studies Centre. They were smart businessmen provisioning the miners rather than digging for gold. And from that side of the family, I've received many privileges, including the $5,000 my parents gave me in 1973, $5,000 in 1973 as a down payment on the $23,000 house I bought in Vancouver at a time when our shared income was about $5,000 a year. On my father's side of the family, my great-great-grandparents were Methodist missionaries sent to South Australia and Fiji, who settled eventually in New Zealand. In the second generation, they were Methodist ministers. In the third and subsequent generations, continue to be small-town doctors. My father broke with the small town and the anti-drinking attitudes of his Methodist parents, but continued the medical tradition. Trained as a physician and heart specialist, he became a pioneer of epidemiological research in New Zealand and the Pacific. Now this is relevant, you might be asking why I talk about them, because he gave me my first research job. For several summers while I was completing my BA, he employed me to code the data that he had collected during his epidemiological surveys of the health of Maori people in remote areas of the North Island. And one of my other privileges as a child was to spend time in those communities and get to know people there. Anyway, that experience, the coding data, along with the courses I took in sociology on research methods and statistical analysis, meant I had some understanding of the process of collecting information and sorting it into categories for computer analysis. When I became a historian at a major turning point in history, when the new social history was critiquing the way the history of the nation had been told, and quantitative analyses of censuses and other such data constituted one approach to history from the bottom up, these skills would prove very valuable. I had two wonderful English teachers in high school. They built on my love of reading and honed my writing skills. New Zealand universities were elitist institutions in those days in the sense that only about 10% of school graduates attended them. But those who chose to apply and were accepted were educated for free. I completed a BA in sociology and English from Victoria University in Wellington, where another of my privileges was to have several wonderful professors in each of those disciplines. Then I became part of the large Kiwi brain drain. I arrived in Canada in the new year of 1972, very young, and recently married with my husband John Bradbury, who had been accepted into a PhD program in geography at Simon Fraser. We were privileged immigrants, white, English-speaking, and John was admitted as a landed immigrant simply on the basis of the minimal support that Simon Fraser offered. As a wife, I inherited the same citizenship status. And as British subjects, we were eligible to vote in BC elections, not federal ones, an exciting asset when Davy Barrett's NDP defeated the Social Credit government. So, my plan was to apply to do an MA in sociology. We hoped to complete our degrees and return to New Zealand. I don't think we knew that Simon Fraser was only 7 years old then, nor did we know much about the radicalism that had erupted there, most notably over tenure and promotion, policies in political science, sociology, and anthropology, and over the dismissal of radical faculty. The university's actions had led, prior to our arrival, to a censure by Kaut and to the suspension of graduate studies in that department, which meant I could not study sociology there. I applied to UBC, armed with the suggestion of a relative that I go and talk to the only person he knew, Dorothy Smith. She would later become one of Canada's leading feminist sociologists. She was clearly not considered an asset then by her department. I had great trouble finding her office in the sprawling UBC campus in an out-of-the-way portable. She was not there the day I went, and I had not been courageous enough to arrange a meeting ahead of time. But I did pluck up my courage and visit the graduate director of the sociology department. He was a young Brit, and readily found in the centrally located main sociology department. I still remember our conversation vividly. "Oh, you want to study here, do you? Well, where did you come in your graduating class?" So I told him we weren't told such things in New Zealand, and then I sort of thought on my face, said, "Oh, well, one student got an A+, I received a B+, and everyone else got a B- or less, so I guess I came second." He says, "Oh, you might have a chance then." So I applied and was put on the top of their waiting list. Thankfully, in retrospect, no one turned them down. I could have waited another year and tried again. In the meantime, I had a job in the SFU library, sticking labels and books in SFU library on 3 sides, so I continued at that. Then one day, John saw an advertisement in the newspaper saying that the history department at SFU was offering a part-time, nighttime MA course aimed at lawyers and teachers seeking an MA in the history of Canada or South America. Obviously a marketing ploy, it was never tried again. Anyway, I'd always loved reading history, but had never studied at university, thinking sociology was much more likely to lead to a decent job. So I thought it would be fun to learn a bit about this country I was going to visit just for a little while, as long as it would take John to finish his PhD and me my MA, so I applied. No one noticed or cared that I only had a 3-year degree, no courses in history, and that I was not a lawyer or a teacher there. Groupe ciblé. Twist number 1, and one of the best twists of my life. I shifted disciplines and began to learn Canadian history. Here my intellectual debts are to my professors who suffered through my ignorance and recognised my potential. I'd never been east of the Rockies. Understanding the geography, let alone the history, was a huge and exciting challenge. After 1 year studying part-time, I applied to go full-time and got a position as a TA. George Cook, a Bermudan with a PhD in Canadian history, had developed a wonderful course that taught students how to research history by pushing them to analyze primary documents on a specific theme, approaching it from multiple angles and through the writings and historical lenses of different historians, political, social, economic, etc. And I think I really learned historical methods and sources as a teaching assistant in that course. Focused then on the reasons why British Columbia decided to join Confederation in 1871. He'd also collected documents for a similar course on the 1930s depression in British Columbia, focusing on Burnaby, the suburb in which Simon Fraser is located and where I lived. And he generously gave me all those documents, which ended up forming a portion of what I drew upon to write my MA thesis, which explored the history of 4 Vancouver suburban municipalities during the early 30s. Okay, my thinking about how to undertake that project was based in part on his insistence on the importance of political history. So I carefully traced the complicated negotiations and relations between municipalities, provinces, and the federal government in the early Depression years. This was good training and was especially fascinating because of the strategies deployed by the radical mayor of Burnaby, William Pritchard, one of the One Big Union supporters who'd earlier been rounded up and jailed following the Winnipeg General Strike. Other professors at SFU pushed me to look at the ways social historians in the States were using city directories and other sources to say something about ordinary people's lives. There was little social history published in Canada then, but there was a growing interest in it among a few of the students in history and in geography on what Hugh Johnson in his book on Simon Fraser has called the radical campus. If I learned historical research and Canadian history from historians, it was the geography students with whom I hung out who taught me most about theory, specifically Marxist and socialist theory and class analysis. Despite the boycott, SFU attracted radical graduate students in all disciplines, and in many ways graduate students in geography took up the mantle from PSA. There, Brits, Irish Americans, and a few Canadians mingled and became a large contingent of the geographers involved in the Union of Socialist Geographers, which was founded in 1974. Now, as John and I had this house and a large garden, we invariably hosted events or offered beds to visiting geographers, who at that time included a young David Harvey, for example, and others who've since written key works on place, space, the city, etc. So it was with geographers that I read Marx, Poulantzas, and other theoreticians while devouring the new works of Canadian political economy as they appeared. In those days, I was an honorary geographer and an apprentice historian. As was true of so many such groups at the time, women were involved, but men were most prominent. Geography as a discipline was a tough nut for women to crack. And the analyses that the male geographers were interested in at that stage were Marxist or socialist, never feminist, despite the presence at SFU of mathematics professor Maggie Benston, who published one of the earliest works of the Canadian women's liberation movement in the late 60s, The Political Economy of Women's Liberation. It was only when some of us formed our own alternative feminist reading group that we began to read her and the growing number of feminist authors. In that group were women who became some of the earliest Canadian feminist geographers. There were no female professors in either geography or history departments when I arrived at SFU. And in those early 1970s, one male professor thought it completely acceptable to complain to me and my fellow MA student, Barbara Roberts, over a beer, that having just remarried, he had no idea to relate to women students anymore, as he could no longer sleep with them. I hope we've got beyond that. There was little feminist about my MA thesis, which eventually compared politics, class structures, and unemployment in 4 Vancouver suburbs during the 1930s. After completing it in 1974, I spent one summer funded by an LIP grant, another privilege of our generation, government-funded summer research for students, interviewing Burnaby residents about their experiences during the Depression. I loved it, but also realized how time-consuming interviews can be. I then taught Canadian history for 2 years at Capilano College in North Vancouver, now a university. And it was through teaching that I really became, I think, a Canadian historian, if that's what I am, with a reasonable knowledge of its contours. By then, works in Canadian social history were beginning to appear, building in diverse ways on the growing field elsewhere. By that time, the Annales School in France, with its focus on mentalité, demography, and la longue durée, had existed for decades. In England, E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, initially published in '63, had become a bestseller in its paperback version, offering a cultural reading of how classes formed. And in the US and England, Richard Sennett, Michael Anderson, and others had begun to analyze the manuscripts of censuses to examine questions of family structure and social mobility. And women's history was emerging as another thread of social history. I think the first collection of articles in Canadian social history, which was edited by my Glendon colleague, Michael Horn and Ron Sabarin, was published in 1974, the year I completed my MA. But it was the 1975 book, and some of you have heard the story before, by Michael Katz, The People of Hamilton, Canada West, Family and Class in the Mid-19th Century, that I think provoked a turning point in my thinking about how I might write history. It used the original forms, the manuscripts of Canadian censuses of Hamilton, Ontario, to present a portrait of its population, its social structures, families, and social dynamics. I don't think this is his best work, not as good as much of his earlier or later writing. Yet at that time, I found the work fascinating for its methodology, if frustrating for some of the analyses and much of the writing. The numbers overwhelmed the peoples whose lives he was trying to capture. It read at times like a verbal version of a computer printout. Women and children were there, but largely as statistical categories, and often as victims. And as I began to think about a PhD project, I felt I could do something different, blending a quantitative analysis of the census with the questions that more and more feminists were posing. Now, there were no jobs in New Zealand geography departments in 1977 when John completed his PhD, but there was a position at McGill, and it was to Montreal that we moved in the summer of that year. Houses were cheap in the wake of the first election of a PQ government, so the $43,000 we received for our small Vancouver house allowed us to buy a considerably larger one in NDG in Montreal. I'd applied to both McGill and Concordia to do a PhD. As McGill neither acknowledged my application nor rejected nor accepted me, I began my PhD at Concordia that year. After a year of courses and studying, I completed my comprehensive exams in family, urban, and Quebec history, writing my answers in George Roudet's office and madly hoping that the vibes from the walls in his books would inspire me. I was awfully tired too doing that and didn't realize until a month later that I was pregnant. At that time, Concordia's history department had 2 female professors, an improvement on SFU, Nikki Strongberg and Mary Vipond. Nikki, who was the first woman of our generation to write a PhD in women's history, was going on sabbatical and refused to supervise me. She absolutely denies that now. Mary's interests were different. So I cobbled together a committee with Ron Rudin as my supervisor, he's a Quebec historian, a European family historian, and Jean-Claude Robert from UQAM, who was then one of the new generation of Quebec scholars, trained in France, influenced by the Annales School, and he had recently completed his dissertation on Montreal's early 19th century history. They were a wonderful committee, mostly because they left me alone to work out what I wanted to do. My privileges as a doctoral student included having a husband with a professor's income, especially once we had children. It also helped to have had the experience of assisting him to complete his PhD. I knew what one was. And as I mentioned earlier, it helped, given my project, to know something about statistics, how to collect information and prepare it for computer analysis. I received wonderful encouragement from professors there, including strong recommendations for Shirk fellowships that paid for my daycare costs. Somehow these accidents, the combination of the birth of social history, women's history, of a particular census-based approach to family history, and my lack of fear about computers, came together to make my work seem innovative in Canada, Quebec at the time. So it was a real boost to my confidence when I gave my first conference paper in 1979. on the family economy and work in 1870s Montreal to be approached by several journal editors asking if I would submit it for publication. I think we forget how important such confidence boosting can be. The time I gave that paper, I was visibly pregnant with my first daughter, Anna, something that was not as common at such conferences as it now is. Anyway, that PhD became my first book, Working Families. And in it, I wanted to integrate an analysis of women's unpaid domestic labour, of the ways families raised pigs or cows, took in boarders into I wanted to integrate those questions into the very male and workplace-focused story of industrialisation in Canada that was being constructed largely by working class and labour historians at the time. That's not to denigrate the importance of their work. The shift from a focus on unions to working class history meant that my work could contribute to that field too. When I started that degree in 1977, I think there were only 3 academic books on women's history written in English in Canada and a couple of collections in French on women in Quebec. And most of those had appeared in the previous couple of years. Soon, feminist literature was exploding, or so it seemed, though the pace now seems slow. My women's studies colleague, Meg Luxton, her influential and important study of domestic labour in the single industry town of Flin Flon, Manitoba, More Than a Labour of Love, appeared in 1980, as did Sylvia Van Kirk's path-breaking study of Aboriginal women's contributions to the fur trade, Many Tender Ties. So my study of working families in Montreal stands on the shoulders of these pioneering feminist historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and others who were seeking to make domestic labour visible and to revision key historical events in ways that took gender as well as class into account, to marry family economies and political economies. While feminism and feminist women's history was fundamental to my approach, and my thinking over those years was also shaped by the growing social science history, scholarship, and family history, by urban history, vibrant working class history, and also by the particular contours of social history in Quebec. Family history there was different, influenced as it was in part by the Annales School and by leading local scholars, especially the late Louise Duchesne, and also by the rich sources available. This was a moment in which local parish studies based on analyses of birth, death, and marriage registers and notarial documents proliferated. Quantitative, detailed, economic, and resolutely unfeminist approaches were dominant. More personally, I shared ideas with fellow graduate students, as we all do in graduate school, especially Frances Early, also at Concordia, who was completing her dissertation on French Canadians in Lowell, Massachusetts, and was interested in similar questions about families, women, work, and industry. And Marta Danilevich, who was often in Montreal researching for her dissertation on the work of nuns in Quebec. Later, Marta was hired here at York at Atkinson, and then tragically murdered by her brother, along with the rest of her family. Her book, Taking the Veil, an alternative to marriage, motherhood, and spinsterhood in Quebec, which was published in 1987, after her murder, because of the dedicated work of my colleague Bill Westphal, Paul-André Lanteau from Montreal, and Alison Prentice, one of the pioneers of women's history in Canada, reflects, I think, some of our conversations and our shared interest as outsiders studying Quebec history, determined to take the Catholicism of that province seriously. While completing my PhD, I became a member of what is now known as the Montreal History Group. Working with this collective of scholars has been a consistently rich influence on my thinking as a historian, as well as a source of financial and intellectual support for my research. It was founded in 1976, a year before I arrived in Montreal, and its members were innovators in critical thinking about the use of the particularly rich records produced by Montreal notaries. The MHG, as we call ourselves, continues to be a unique, dynamic group of historians, which brings together francophones and anglophones, faculty members and graduate students from the 4 Montreal universities, who all share an interest in Montreal's history, in methodology, and a broad, loose, socialist feminist approach to writing history. Colin Coates was once a member. We've been remarkably successful at securing funds over the last 30 years and in mentoring young scholars in the arts of grant writing and publication. It was with them that I started a short postdoctoral fellowship in 1984 entitled Widows and Their Families, 1821 to 1861. And the plan in that project was to move away from research based on the census, cross-sections of census households that the census lets you look at, and to draw on parish registers, diverse notarial records, and the records of the criminal justice system to gain a more complex understanding of how widowhood was lived. But I got a postdoc, and then my interest in matters economic, nurtured through social history, labour history, Canadian political economy, and our interests within the Montreal History Group, helped when the Université de Montréal advertised a position for an economic historian in 1985. I didn't apply for the job initially, partly because I didn't consider myself an economic historian, and also because I didn't think my French was good enough to teach. More importantly, a job had been advertised in history at McGill for someone doing family history, quantitative history, and a few other things that looked as if I was pretty well the only qualified person in Canada. By 1985, John and I had 2 daughters, Anna and Emily, and I had no intention of applying for jobs anywhere but Montreal, at least not until we returned to New Zealand, which was still something we hoped to do. Thankfully, in retrospect, McGill decided to hire John Zucchi. Though he did not fit the description at all, he had held a postdoc at Cambridge, not at McGill, and was not too feminist and too socialist for them, as I was later told. Nor had he peaked too early, their other concern about me. Another twist, and a wonderful one. I was hired by the Université de Montréal History Department, though I had to relinquish the postdoc fellowship. René Durocher, the chair, who had pushed me into applying for the job, convinced me that my French would be fine in the classrooms of that department, which included people who spoke French with Russian, Greek, American, and other accents. Some quite incomprehensible to me. They seemed interested in my broad approach to teaching the history of the Canadian economy. Also became clear that they wanted someone to teach Quebec women's history, but politically would or could not advertise such a position. So it was my great privilege to teach economic, family, and women's history at the Université de Montréal for 7 years. There was only one other female faculty member in the department of some 25 or 30 scholars. And it seemed to me at first that all the professors were grey-haired men in grey suits. It took 6 months before they would respond to my bonjour in passing them in the corridors, perhaps because they thought I was a student. But eventually they accepted me. I was given the office, and Quebec historians here appreciate this, that was previously home to Michel Brunet, the prominent member of the Nationalist Montreal School of Quebec History. I worried for the first few years, I think, about his ghost looking over my shoulder, apoplectic about a New Zealander and a woman sitting in his chair. My debts and gratitudes are great to the Quebec historians of that time, both within the university and in the wider community who embraced my presence among them. But it's to the many graduate students, English and French speaking, who came to UDM to work with me or who chose me as their supervisor that I am most grateful. I found myself within 2 years of arriving there with 18 graduate students and being graduate program director. Even with a 2-course load and releases for administration and research, the only way I could think of supervising them more adequately was for us to assess each other's work. Together we read thesis chapters, conference papers, as well as recent publications in Quebec history. Once a month, we combined these discussions with food at someone's house, a tradition I've continued at York, and have found invaluable for enriching classroom graduate education, supervision, and mentoring for job applications, etc. Most of those first graduate students at UDM, many of those whom I've supervised at York since, are now prominent social, political, family historians of Quebec or Canada, and I'm very proud of all of them. And my first PhD student, Dominique Marshall, is the incoming president of the Canadian Historical Association, which makes me feel how many years have passed. But supervision for me was always a two-way street. Graduate students have always shaped what I read, how I think, and what I write. They teach me as much as I teach them. But there I'm jumping ahead a bit. McGill in the 1980s was not so easy for John. Red baiting was common in the geography department, as it was more broadly at McGill in those days. and you didn't need to be a card-carrying member of anything to be subjected to it. This made his pre-tenure years particularly challenging. And John was really intellectually curious and a real teacher, but his earliest education had been in a one-room rural New Zealand school, and he'd always had difficulty writing. So I helped him rewrite his MA thesis, rewrite his PhD thesis, rewrite articles and things. It's really not easy to sit down with your partner and tell them what's wrong with their work. I think this is not a good recipe for a good marriage. So I learned to write criticisms and suggestions constructively, in writing, clearly. And I think this is something that's really helped me when I give feedback to graduate students, or even as current English language editor of Histoire Sociale. Enough on that. In late 1987, John was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He died 6 months later. Our daughters were 8 and 5 years old. Now, along with my neighbors and friends, both John's chair at McGill, Sherry Olson, and my chair, John Dickinson, were fabulous at helping us get through those 6 months and the period afterwards. Each taught me lessons about the pragmatics of administration and life crises that I think have helped me as a graduate director and a chair at York. So too as coming from a family with serious mental health problems. John's death was another unexpected twist that changed my life in many ways. As a widow with 2 young children, I was fortunate in having a tenure-track position and a good salary. My economic privilege was augmented by the considerable pension money that John and McGill had contributed, that became mine, as well as by the Quebec policy that pays widows and orphans significant benefits. Indeed, though I have remarried and left the province, I've been unable to convince bureaucrats there that I should cease to receive the $700 monthly Quebec widow's pension. Québec est une société distincte. Falling in love again with a man who was brave enough to take on a widow and her 2 not always easy daughters was another twist in privilege, and one that led me eventually to Montreal, a city that as an ex-Vancouverite and Montrealer I was sure I would hate, but now love. So my plan to become a landscape gardener in Toronto fell apart with job offers in the city. I ended up coming to York first in 1992, as Ken said, and then permanently in 1994. And I am grateful to Craig for bringing me to Toronto into this university. York, to me, was a breath of fresh air after teaching at tradition-bound, stuffy McGill and UDM. And I must say, for all the muddle that sometimes occurs, I prefer our administrative ways, collegial governance, to those of such older universities. And for a feminist social historian, I can't imagine better departments in which to work than the 3 to which I'm appointed. Cross-appointed, joint-appointed, whatever. Moving to Montreal distanced me from the primary sources I needed for my project on widows and for the rich but small world of Quebec historians. And I guess it also slowed down the publication of my first book. But eventually in 1993, Working Families was published. And since then, I've focused mostly on completing the research on widows, while researching also my broader project looking at marriage, property, and inheritance in 19th century white settler societies. The Widow Project also took a long time as I balanced teaching, research, and administration of various kinds and tried to master the diverse sources and information I had. But it is a much better book than it would have been without the influence of feminist scholarship and colleagues here over those years. With the help of wonderful research assistants, it began as a very quantitative demographic project that pieced together the histories of some 2,000 or so Catholic and Protestant couples, traced in a growing range of sources from their marriages in the 1820s and 1840s to their deaths. Over the time I was working on it, I became less and less interested in the demographic aspects and qualitative analyses of diverse characteristics of their lives. Indeed, I think I developed a love-hate affair with the kind of quantitative family history I and others practiced. And I became more and more interested in the ways the English common law and the custom of Paris, later Quebec Civil Code, framed questions of widowhood, marital property rights, and succession so differently. For that, I had to learn to understand the law as well. I then sought to understand how these differences were reflected in the choices couples made in marriage contracts and wills, and how they shaped widows' claims on resources. The book, which was finally published last year, reflects the major epistemological shifts of feminist and broader academic thought from the 90s on, especially the growing critique of structuralist explanations, the shift from social to cultural history, from things to words, and the continuing critique of anti-racist theorists and scholars. These two broad moves, the cultural turn and anti-racist scholarship, reshaped how I approached widows and widowhood, and both produced angst, conflicts, even wars among historians and feminist scholars. And I said this before, but I like the metaphor, I guess it is. I felt for a while like a socialist feminist historian surfing the linguistic turn on a structuralist surfboard. But perhaps that's the safest way to surf, boards rather than words. For me, it was teaching, especially graduate students again. They helped me think through how to combine materialist and cultural analyses, structuralist, post-structuralist, and some post-colonial theorizing. In the end, I combined an analysis of material aspects of their marriages, their furniture, their wealth, the numbers of children, demographies of death and remarriage, with an exploration of the legal culture and the laws of the times. I tried to show readers widows involved in making inventories of the goods in their homes after their husbands' deaths, widows acting as executors of their husband's will, as tutors for their children, widows taking part in elections in Montreal in 1832, and widows as they aged. And I tried to focus on the individual biographies of some 25 widows and weave those through the chapters, following their lives as they went from wife to widow. And I hope that one of its major contributions lies in locating practices required by the law squarely within the lives of particular women and men, some wealthy, some poor, and most in between. Somewhere along the way, my love-hate affair with quantitative history turned into a new and unexpected pleasure at piecing together such biographies of individuals and families in much the same way that genealogists do, helped by the growing amount of material that's searchable online. In Wife to Widow, I think I referred to my method as being one of collective genealogy. Now, as I try to complete my work on my more recent project, I'm drawn to the intersections of biography, genealogy, and microhistory as a way to write interesting, accessible history. The Widows Project and my interest in what I came to see as the peculiarities of the English common law regarding wives' subjugation and limited property rights within marriage led me to think more broadly about the geography of legal systems and the rights of wives and widows at a transnational level. So the project explores questions of marriage, property, and inheritance in 19th century white settler colonies, specifically Australia, New Zealand, Quebec, and the Cape. And it's shaped by the rich literature of the last 15 to 20 years, exploring questions of gender and empire, which have provided me with another set of tall feminist shoulders on which to build. And teaching a graduate course on women and gender viewed transnationally over the last 15 years or so has also helped shape my ideas. In elaborating that project, I think the most influential work for me has been that of Catherine Hall, and especially the research that appeared as her 2002 book, Civilizing Subjects, Metropole and Colony in the English Imagination, 1830 to 1867. Roy Porter describes that book as doing for colonial history what E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class did for social history. And what I love in her work, and others in the field, of history of gender and empire, I think three main things. The skill at dealing with gender, race, and class concurrently, not as individual or even interacting categories, but as operational forces in both discursive and material realms. And I loved her ability, and still do, to integrate biographies, including her own, that disrupt the easy categorization of lives or identities, and that make individuals key actors. And I love how the broader literature demonstrates the mutual impact of colonies on metropole and vice versa in terms of economic matters like trade, discursive matters such as understandings about the meanings of race and gender or marriage and nation. At the same time, as I suppose a colonial twice over, I resist the tendency of Hall and other British historians to write as if the most significant relations of empire are those between Britain and her colonies. And I like and am drawn to the growing literature often written from the sites of former colonies, that stresses networks and webs of personal relations, family, literature, and meaning-making spun across and beyond the sites of empire. For me to research and write a history that pulls together New Zealand, the place of my birth, Australia, where our daughters now live, Canada, the site of my adulthood, and the Cape, a previously unknown location for me, offers a way to pull these sites of empire, some of them my sites, together in one analytic frame. But how to take this on? 4 colonies, a century, diverse histories, different historiographical traditions. Do I want to spend another 20 years writing a book? And my sense of what I want to do in this project has shifted. Thanks to a Shirk grant, I have a sense of the laws passed regarding marriage, property, inheritance. I've read the parliamentary debates. I've consulted legal cases that are reported, looked at some of the newspapers. But this is all pretty dull stuff, except that every legal case tells individual and family stories, and some contests about issues of property spilled out of the courts and case books into the newspapers, legislative assemblies, or higher courts, shifting laws, shifting jurisprudence, changing the history of that colony alongside individual lives. Without making a conscious decision to do so, I found myself being seduced, I think, by these stories into writing one family history in each colony. I no longer wanted to cut up individual stories, placing different parts of people's lives in different chapters, as I did in most of Wife to Widow. So for this project, tentatively entitled Colonial Legacies, I feel compelled to build more detailed biographies around particular family property and inheritance struggles that reveal important elements of changing laws in that colony's history. And through these biographies, I hope to demonstrate how important it is to think about property, marriage, and inheritance as matters that were critical to legitimating the making of white settlers. You can all breathe for a minute. I'm nearly done. So, through these biographies, I hope to demonstrate how important it is to think about property, marriage, and inheritance as matters that were critical to legitimating the making of white settler colonies in the wake of or alongside Indigenous dispossession, and how these were issues that transcended the boundaries of particular colonies. In the Cape, for example, I'm following the life histories of Mary Ann Blatchford and her husband. They were poor British immigrants who arrived in the Cape in the 1840s, but became wealthy enough to purchase a farm, thanks in part to her work running a shop, first in Cape Town and then near Stellenbosch. When he died, leaving the farm to his illegitimate son, who had joined them 3 years earlier, she contested the will. She claimed the rights of a wife under the Roman Dutch law, retained for civil matters after the British took over control of the colony, just as the custom of Paris was retained for Quebec. Her case was an important thread in opening up a huge debate in that colony about laws of marriage and inheritance, and about whether these were determined by the place of residence when a couple married, or by the laws of the place in which they accumulated their property. It became a debate about the relative merits of Roman Dutch law and English common law, pitting militant John Bull English colonizers supporting the extraordinary control the English common law gave husbands against Dutch, Cape, and other supporters of the much more family, children, and widow-focused Roman Dutch law, and eventually leading to some changes in that law. And debaters insisted again and again that suitable laws regarding marriage, inheritance, and property were critical to attracting the right kind of settlers. In New Zealand, I'm looking at the family of Mary Ann Rhodes, the illegitimate daughter of William Barnard Rhodes, a whaling captain and Maori woman. She ended up contesting the interpretation of her father's will, first in the New Zealand courts, and then she appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London in 1882. Now, William had become very wealthy, in part through land deals, both straight and crooked, with Maori chiefs. When he died, he owned extensive assets and real estate, a fantastic mansion on the hills of Wellington, and significant rural property. He had no legitimate children, I should add. He had had his will redrafted when he was very close to death, and his lawyer, who rather liked to drink, had inserted clauses that were ambiguous at best. William was in no state to fully grasp its contents, as it was read aloud to him 2 days before his death. The executors decided the will meant one thing, the stamp duty collectors another. And all of this made a difference to whether Mary Ann, the illegitimate daughter, would inherit the use, the income, huge income, that some said would make her the wealthiest woman in New Zealand, right away or after her stepmother, Sarah Ann, died. As was not uncommon in disputes about family fortunes, this family friction became a national issue, referred to eventually as the Great New Zealand Will Case. Now, this might seem to pit Mary Ann against her stepmother, but that's not the case. It was Sarah, the stepmother, who assisted her in the court cases, travelled to London with her, and helped her really every step along the way. So this story of British stepmother, illegitimate Maori daughter who became immensely rich when the Privy Council decided in her favour, raises a host of interlocking issues about class, race, gender, and the law. It also allows me to explore the hierarchies of affections expressed in wills, the dilemma of men with dynastical pretensions who had no sons, and the lives of the widow and daughter he left at his death. Mary Ann's appeal to the Privy Council, the ultimate appeal court of empire, allows me to locate her case among appeals from Bengal, Canadian provinces, and other parts of the empire. It serves as a reminder that the eminent British jurists who staffed the Judicial Committee judged private colonial family frictions and fortunes about property and inheritance alongside the merits of cases regarding commercial and constitutional conflicts. But here I seem to stray from Canadian studies, surfing, paragliding perhaps off to other parts of the world. And yet, there were multiple connections in these 19th century colonies, economic, discursive, familial, etc. Just before she died, Mary Ann's stepmother, the widow Sarah Rhodes, was very excited about the increase in the value of her shares in the Canadian Pacific Railway. In the will that she had rewritten, after 34 years of widowhood and hid under the bed in her mansion in the Wellington Hills, she had bequeathed these shares to Mary Ann's 2 daughters, born and raised in England. So Mary Ann, after becoming the wealthiest woman in New Zealand, migrated back to England and lived very much as country gentry. Anyway, so she bequeathed these Canadian Pacific shares, which had increased dramatically in value, to Mary Ann's 2 daughters. She also left significant sums to nephews, nieces, and other relatives in England, New Zealand, Australia, and the Cape. So her life and family, like mine, and so many 19th century lives, was lived across white settler societies. Another twist, I had no idea, when I started piecing this particular story together, that the Rhodes mansion was built on the hills of the suburb in which I grew up in Wellington, right in front of where I lived. Anyway, where to end? How to conclude? Twists. In many ways, it was these personal twists that brought me to study in Canada, first in Vancouver, then Montreal and Toronto. John and my decision to go to Vancouver rather than universities in England or the US for his PhD. Wasn't quite a sentence. The twist resulting from SFU radicalism that meant I did not get accepted into sociology and began to become a Canadian historian. His twist of luck in being offered a job in geography at McGill, and the much worse twist of fate leading to his cancer and death. Remarriage and moving to Toronto. Personal twists, most of which have something to do, one might suggest, with following a man, but in all these cases, these were collective decisions that I've never regretted, and I've learned and shared much with my 2 feminist former husbands. Turns and turning points. As a feminist historian studying Canadian families for rather more decades than I like to admit, I have, like the rest of us, witnessed major epistemological shifts. I came to history from the bottom up, social history, with some skills in quantitative analysis, thanks in part to my father, that were rare among women at the time. I learned the significance of a class analysis through the radicalism and scholarship of the 70s at the Radical campus, Simon Fraser, and that was enriched by the work of Canadian working class historians, including those at York. Like many of my colleagues, but perhaps more so, I could not avoid the growing critique of social history and of quantitative history in particular. The cultural linguistic turn and anti-racist critiques have reshaped feminist theorizing and the discipline of history along with other disciplines. Other turns, transnational, effective, biographical, enrich debates and help me rethink how to write Wife to Widow, and especially how to conceptualize the study of marriage, property, and inheritance across the empire. When that tiny project is complete, I plan to turn to my own family, those Jewish and Methodist ancestors of mine and their life histories. I approach these more biographical projects convinced that a rich grounding in social history makes us better historians, conscious of the complexities of power, and that it can be blended with insights of cultural history, and in the approach I hope to take at the interface of biography, microhistory, genealogy, and the histories of nation and empire. Guess we all navigate these intellectual turns in our own ways. Tall shoulders. Geography at Simon Fraser, fellow graduate students at Concordia, the Montreal History Group, my York colleagues, especially Anne Rubenstein, Kate McPherson, Molly Ladd-Taylor, and Michelle Johnson, who all read and discussed a very long manuscript version of Wife to Widow, and Craig Heron, who also read it, and over many of my years here shared stories, shared parenting, and taught me so much about history, Ontario, and about more mundane things like tidiness. These are some of the tall shoulders on which I stand. From debates about class with geographers and the admirable, it's not admirable at all if you know it, the Admiral Bar in Burnaby, an extremely seedy bar. Grappling with Quebec history from Michel Brunet's former office, navigating linguistic turn in teaching with colleagues and graduate students here at York, and the wider historical and feminist scholarship, I have learned so much. Over the years of my academic career to date, feminists have transformed most disciplines, academia, the law, and society, and it's been a great privilege to be part of that. I was privileged to work in a Francophone university and to be welcomed as a Quebec historian, which makes this most recent prize very, very precious to me. I was privileged to be a member of a research collective that's persisted over 30 years. And over the last 2 decades, I've had the privilege to work in the company of the best colleagues I can imagine having, in history on both campuses, in what I'll call women's studies, to keep it short, and in Canadian studies. And most recently, to have a wonderful chair in LA&PS, Jonathan Edmiston, who'll be up here in a minute. Such a rich crowd of tall shoulders. I'd like to thank you all for listening, coming, and thank Colin for inviting me.